Welcome to Business Talk, a global podcast series where we bring you closer to some of the world's most distinguished scholars and their impactful ideas. I'm Deepak, your host from India. Today we have the pleasure of hosting a scholar whose work sits at the intersection of how organizations function and how people behave within them. Dr. Robert Doer joins us as a professor of economics at Erasmus University, Rotterdam, and as a research fellow connected with leading institutes, including the Timbergen Institute, CIFO Munich, and IGA Bonn. Over the years, his academic journey has taken him across Europe with visiting roles at Bochum University, the University of Munich, and the University of Vienna. At the heart of Professor Robert's work is a simple but powerful question. What truly drives people to perform? And how can organizations design better systems to support both productivity and well-being? His research brings together personal, organizational, and behavioral economics, blending theory with real-world evidence. Currently, he is leading a series of field experiments within companies and public sector institutions, exploring how incentives and feedback shape the way people work and feel. His contributions have been recognized in some of the world's most respected journals in economics, including the American Economic Review, the Economic Journal, the Journal of Labor Economics, and the Journal of Public Economics. Alongside this, he also served as an academic community as an associate editor of Economics of Governance. In today's episode, Professor Robert takes us into the world of policy experimentation, sharing insights from his thought-provoking work, Who's Afraid of Policy Experiments? Professor Robert, thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure and privilege to have you with us today.
Thank you very much. The pleasure is all on my side. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Professor, to begin, could you briefly explain what you mean by a policy experiment and why such experiments can be so powerful for improving public policy?
Yeah. Now, that is a very important question because the word experiment is used in many different ways. And what we have in mind in this piece of research is what I tend to call like a good experiment, a high quality experiment, an experiment from which you can really learn something about what causes what. And there are at least two important conditions for a good experiment. The first is that it's sufficiently large scale. And the second is that there's randomization, that subjects or organizational units or regional districts, that they are randomly assigned either to a treatment or control. And then the power of such experiments is that if you run good experiments, that you can really learn in a very reliable way what the effect is of a particular intervention. And then you can think of policy interventions, such as like training programs for unemployed people, or you can think about all kind of policy measures to try and reduce discrimination, or you can think about a new policing strategy that is then first tried out in a subset of police districts that are the treatment group and not in another set of districts that are the control group. So you do the new policy for some time in a part of the total sample, and you compare with the control group to see whether it makes any difference. And oftentimes the results of these experiments are surprising in both directions. Sometimes when there's lots of trust and confidence that a particular policy will be very good, sometimes delivers hardly anything. But also the opposite happens, that very light touch interventions that people have no high hopes about turn out to be highly effective. And I would say that both types of lessons are lessons very important to learn.
Professor, your paper starts from the observation that randomized policy experiments are still relatively rare, even though they can generate very clean evidence. What first motivated you to investigate whether voter attitudes might be part of the explanation?
Yeah, well, the main reason for that is that it was oftentimes mentioned to me by people whenever I was proposing to run randomized experiments. And so I've been trying to set up these randomized policy experiments at many different places in the public sector, at ministries, but also at monitoring authorities, or also at like big cities and so on. And then oftentimes the people I was talking with, they would tell me like, yeah, I think this is a very appealing idea to run an experiment. And I also understand why it is valuable and why it leads to important results. But I think that the voters will not understand why we would do it in this way. They will not appreciate the power of experimentation. They will have all kind of concerns about experimentation. And so better not do it, better try to get an idea about the effect of the intervention in some other way. And so I thought when I heard those remarks oftentimes about voters and citizens not being able to understand the power of experimentation, well, let's see if you just engage with them and spend a little bit of time and energy explaining what it is about. Let's see whether indeed there is so much misunderstanding and little appreciation for these policy experiments. And so that made us design a questionnaire that was then sent to a representative sample of the population, where we tried in just a handful of sentences. We tried to make these sentences very clear. And we explained what a policy experiment is about, how it works. We gave several examples, and then we asked, how would you feel about it? And as it turns out, citizens are very positive about this experimentation.
Professor, you surveyed a sample that is representative of the Dutch electoral using the LISS panel. Could you walk us through how this panel works and why it provides a solid basis for studying public opinion on policy experiments?
Yeah, so the LISS panel is an existing panel consisting of about 6,000 people, all living in the Netherlands. And they take part in a questionnaire, an online questionnaire, about once every month or so. And what is special about this LISS panel, as opposed to many other existing panels or samples, is that at the LISS panel organization, they made a very strong effort to make the sample representative. And I find that very important because oftentimes what you see is studies being done on convenient samples. That means on groups of people that are readily willing to take part in questionnaires. But these samples tend to be typically a little bit special. For instance, they may be particularly open to scientific research, for instance, if they know that the questionnaire contributes to scientific research. Now, for our question, whether people appreciate experimentation, it was, of course, very important to get a truly representative sample of the population, including also people who are not so much in favor of science or maybe even skeptical of science, right? We want to include them as well in our sample. And with the LISS panel that is actually run at Tilburg University, we have good chances that we actually have a pretty good representative sample of the Dutch population. I did several checks as well. For instance, can I reproduce the Dutch national election outcome with what people say in the LISS panel? And the answer is, well, pretty good. You can pretty good reproduce the national election outcome. So that is really nice. Now, by the way, so our study is about the Netherlands, so we only have Dutch data. But in the meantime, our study has now been out for 1 or 2 years. In the meantime, other researchers in other countries, they have set up similar surveys, sometimes even including exactly the same questions as we have. And I'm very happy to say that now our main results have also been replicated, have been found also in other countries, including Finland, France, Poland, Ireland, Romania, US, Australia. So there seems to be quite a bit of support for our main findings right now, beyond just the Dutch case. So I'm very happy about that.
Professor, one of your key findings is that Voters actually support policy experimentation, especially when they do not hold strong prior opinions about a policy. How did you measure this support? And what surprised you most about the results?
Yeah, so the way that we measured it is we showed to the respondents a couple of concrete cases of policies where, in principle, you could first run a policy experiment, find out what the effect is before you decide on full implementation. And so we had several examples of such policies. I mentioned already a couple in the beginning, like, for instance, a new policing strategy that you could experiment with. If you have a big country with many different police districts, then you can first do it in, I don't know, a random 30 or 40 districts and not in the other districts as yet. Compare outcomes and see whether this new policing strategy makes any sense, for instance, in terms of reducing crime. But you can also think of measures taken to reduce discrimination. So, for instance, a favorite policy of many companies is to send people to a diversity training. Well, if you're curious about whether these diversity trainings have any real effects on behaviors, maybe also on attitudes of people, you can first run an experiment where you send a randomly selected group of people from your company to a diversity training, and then the remainder not, that's the control group, and you track these two groups over time to see whether the group that did the training behaves in any different way as compared to the control group. So we sketched those concrete cases to our respondents of these concrete policies. And then we asked three questions. So the first question was, how much do you favor implementation of this policy, to see whether they actually find this policy a good idea? To be sure, we also asked them, how much or what do you think about not implementing the policy? To really detect, like, okay, so who is like really in favor or really opposed to the policy. And finally, we asked about the very same policy, how would you feel about an experiment? And then we described in a handful of sentences what an experiment is about. That it's about randomization and temporarily only a handful or more than a handful, but like a random subset is exposed to the policy, and you compare with the control to learn and so on. Now, and then what we found is that on policies where people hold very strong opinions, either in favor of implementation or against implementation, people tend also not to like experimentation too much. And the reasoning is very simple. They just love or they just hate the policy. So they made up their mind, right? They're not very curious about the effects that it has measured in a reliable way. So instead, so the people who are sort of in the middle, who are not very much in favor, neither very much against, those are the people who have most demand or wish for learning more about the effects of the policy. They're sort of on the fence on the policy, and then they can be convinced by the results from a proper experiment. And so among this group, we find the biggest support for policy experimentation. You also asked, like, what surprised us most about this. Well, in a sense, it's sort of obvious result, like this is what you would expect. But that I also find quite helpful, to detect also in data that, stuff makes sense, because sometimes people also say, like, look, in surveys and questionnaires, people can say anything. It's just like noise or so that you get, right? Well, these kind of results tell us that it's not like random statements that or random answers that people give in a survey. It seems quite clear that they think about this seriously, and so we get results that make a lot of sense. By the way, at the end of the questionnaire, which is also quite nice, the LISS panel also asked the respondents about whether they found the questions clear or not. And one question that I particularly like is they ask, did this questionnaire make you think? And there we got a pretty high score. So it made many people think. And I think that's also quite nice, actually, if your study makes people think. No? Yeah.
Dr. Robert, many people worry that experiments in public policy raise ethical concerns. For example, about unequal treatment or lack of informed consent. How do voters in your study seem to balance these ethical worries against the potential benefit of learning from experiments?
Yeah, now that is a very important point. So there is like number of concerns that are often raised against experimentation. So one of them is that voters will not understand. Well, we talked about that, but others are indeed that you create, at least for some time, inequality of outcomes because you treat people in different ways, and people may have ethical concerns with it. Another concern that is oftentimes raised is the lack of informed consent. Typically, when you run like a large scale policy experiment, for instance, together with the national tax authorities, it's not the case that you're going to first ask consent to each and every taxpayer before you start running the experiment. And some people take issue with that. There's no informed consent. So there are concerns about this. Now, in our study, we also asked the respondents about whether they are concerned about these matters, okay, including the inequality of outcomes, lack of informed consent, and a couple of other concerns. And yes, people are concerned. So for each concern, between 25 and 35% of people, they say they are concerned about this. Now, it is not the case that everybody is concerned about everything. So some people find the fairness a big concern, others find the lack of informed consent a concern, others have yet other concerns. Moreover, what we see in our data is that if you have ethical concerns, it does not necessarily mean that you're not in favor of policy experimentation. Why? Well, because people make a trade-off. So yes, inequality of outcomes in the short run is not nice, but if as a result of that, you can learn important policy lessons so that policy improves in the future, then we need to make a trade-off, right? Of the pros and the cons of running policy experiments. And it seems that many of our respondents, which are representative of the population, make this trade-off. They are concerned about matters, but they also see the beneficial side of experimentation. And then for some issues, well, the balance is in favor of experimentation. For others, it's the other way around. But all in all, the whole picture is that most citizens tend to find it a very good idea if governments would run policy experiments much more often, despite there being concerns. Yeah.
Professor also conducted a survey experiment with Dutch politicians. How did you design that part of the study? And what did you learn about how politicians respond when they are informed about voters' actually views on policy experiments?
Yeah, thank you for this question because this is one of the favorite parts of our study. So, yeah, we first collected these data in the LISS panel about representative sample of the population. And then once we had these results, we thought, hey, maybe now it's the time to show these results to politicians. But well, we experimentalists, we never waste an opportunity to run a good experiment. And so what we did is we contacted a lot of politicians, Dutch politicians, so both members of parliament and members of regional parliaments. We contacted them and we wrote them, look, we recently did this study among Dutch voters, and it was about policy issues, and we have interesting results, we believe. Now, we also have a few questions for you, but it's just 4 questions, and you will be done with the survey within a couple of minutes. And then along the way, we will also share you some of the results that we got from our study that we already did among the voters, including voters on your party. So this is the way that we encouraged politicians to take part in our survey. And then when politicians arrived in our online environment, then we first told them a little bit about our study among voters. So we told them that it was about policy experiments, and we gave them like similar examples of concrete policies where you could in principle run policy experiments. We explained what a policy experiment is about, a good one is about. And then we asked them, what do you think that voters think about this policy experimentation? What do you think that and do you think that Dutch voters are actually in favor of this? That's what we asked first. And then after that, we showed to a random half of the politicians that took part in our survey, we showed them our results, because we knew already what the voters actually think. And so we exposed those politicians to our results on voters liking policy experimentation and so on. And after that, we asked them the last two questions, and that is, how do you feel about policy experiments? Okay? Now, we also had a control group, exactly the same procedure, except that the results on voters were not shown to them in the middle of the survey, but at the end. So after asking, how do you feel about policy experiments, and are you willing to take action to set up more policy experiments? Then we shared in the control group the results of our survey among voters. And so in this way, we get a fair idea about how politicians currently think about policy experimentation and what is the effect of exposing them to the results of our study. Now, and then the result of all this is that politicians' opinions are not like fixed, are not like set in stone. They are flexible. So if you tell politicians how voters feel about policy experimentation, then politicians, they move towards what voters think. And so we thought this was a nice way to expose politicians to our results and also see whether that in any ways matters, and the latter we can confirm.
Professor, a common argument is that politicians are afraid of being seen as experimenting on citizens. Based on your findings, do you think this fear is justified, or are politicians perhaps misreading the electorate?
Yeah, I think they are misreading indeed. And yeah, so politicians who still believe that it's like that, I would recommend to read our paper. The paper is open access online. It's published in the Economic Journal last year. And I think it just convincingly shows that these concerns and worries that many politicians have, that voters will not understand what is the value of a good policy experiment, is a misreading of the electorate. Yes, yeah. Now, I said that so the data are Dutch, but there have by now been a number of studies in like 6, 7, 8 different countries, also finding the same result. Of course, this doesn't mean that you can extrapolate to each and every country in the world. It would be great if we would have even more countries covered, including in Asia, in Africa, and so on. So I hope that that will happen in the next few years. But in particular, in the countries that have already been covered, I think we can now be quite confident that if you explain, and you only need a handful of sentences, if you explain to the voters, and I think it's also important to be transparent to voters, so don't do these kind of things like secretly or so, and all kind of conspiracy theories can build up or so. So do it transparently, explain well, voters will appreciate.
Professor, your study connects to a broader literature on the ethics and practice of field experiments in economics and political science. How does your work speak to ongoing debates about when experiments are acceptable and how they should be communicated to the public?
Yeah, so I think now after our study, there's reason for much more optimism than before. And then in particular also because of the replications that have been done. So it's not like a standalone finding, but it's now sort of becoming like a stylized track that you tend to find in different samples. And yeah, so the conclusion that I draw from all this is that there's quite a bit of reason for optimism on this account. It doesn't mean that researchers don't need to think about the design, or that they can sort of carelessly now start designing policy experiments everywhere or something like that. Not at all, because as we have discussed, it is the case that voters also have worries. And so it is very important to be careful with designing, to try and minimize the reasons for worry. And also, there are, of course, also cases where experimentation, all in all, is not a good idea. For instance, when already a strong body of knowledge and evidence on a matter exists, then running a randomized policy experiment only brings about worries and no important lessons, right? So that is a very bad idea to do. One should generally only consider this tool of evaluation, a very strong and powerful tool of evaluation, when you're curious about the effects, when you really want to know what the effects are, because it's important for society to learn about this. And then you want to overcome the worries that also exist. You trade off the benefits of learning these important about these important effects and the worries that you create. Yeah, so that the balance overall is a big plus. Yeah.
Dr. Robert, a straight question. If a minister or senior civil servant came to you after reading this paper and said, I want to run more policy experiments, but I'm worried about public backlash, what practical advice would you give them on designing and framing these experiments?
Yeah, so I think this transparency is very important. And the transparency already begins in the design phase. And if you do it in the design phase, then you can also, at an early stage, already collect possible worries that people have that you didn't think about in advance. And you can also do that by, for instance, using something like the LISS panel, so that you ask like a representative sample of the population about how they feel about it, what concerns do they have, and then think about ways to try and address those and so on. So be transparent from the beginning on. I think that is key. And then along the way, I mean, if many people voice very strong concerns, then you can still decide, no, like, oh, apparently this was not such a great idea. The concerns seem to be bigger than what it could possibly bring. So let's not do it here. But based on our research, chances are quite high that on many policy issues, the balance will be positive. Because on many issues, we tried like 6 or 7 or so in our study. And actually, on almost all of these contexts, the experimentation option was the most favored, was the most popular in the population. Stronger than just implementing or just not implementing. And I think it would be very good if politicians and policymakers would take a more curious stance and would be open to setting up additional evidence collection so that we really know whether new policy initiatives are actually worth pursuing and are worth the cost that we make for them.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking ahead, what are the most important open questions for future research on policy experiments, either about voter and politician attitudes or about the design and governance of these experiments in real-world settings?
Yeah. So I think there are many opportunities here for further study. So one we already discussed, and that is to try and see whether these results are also supported in other continents in the world. I think that's very important. Secondly, I think it would also be really nice if we would learn more about the acceptability of experimentation in business context. And actually, there is already a really nice study done on that. It's about actions that for-profit firms take when they are in contact with their customers. And so there has been a really nice study in a marketing science journal. By the way, we also cited papers, so viewers or listeners who are interested can look it up. So so there also they have studied how acceptable people find it when they are experimented on by for-profit firms, and they are then in their role of like customers at a company. And then a key finding of this paper is that also there it seems that customers are not necessarily opposed to experimentation. They are opposed to certain business practices, in particular business practices that may harm them. They don't like those practices. And so they oppose experimentation with those practices. But if it's practices that may benefit them, then they find it totally justified that businesses also run experiments to try and find out what customers want, what they find attractive, whether things work well, and so on. So I think that's also a really nice area where studies can be done. I was talking now about the context of customers, but another very important area in businesses where many more experiments can be done that are very useful is in the area of human resource management. The way we pay people, but also the way we try and motivate people. I know that literature very well, as you mentioned in the beginning, and there are still many open questions. And we also know that it's the answers to important questions on human resources are oftentimes context specific. So you cannot just export a piece of wisdom from one context, let's say the US or India, to, for instance, my country, the Netherlands. You cannot always be sure that you will find similar effects. And so also a much more open, curious stance of like human resource managers or firms more generally on the issue of HR policies would be totally welcomed, I think, and would improve these policies within firms. And I would be very curious also about how people in the role of workers would feel about experimentation with these kind of matters. And as far as I know, nobody has ever studied that question. I'm hopeful that we would, like with the policy experiments and with experimentation with customers, find sort of similar results, but well, only new study will tell, right? So I think that's also a very interesting open area of research.
Thank you, Professor Robert Doerr, for sharing your research insights and for helping us think more clearly about how policy experiments can shape better public decisions. It has been a pleasure having you on the show, and we hope this conversation encourages more thoughtful, evidence-based policy making. Thank you for joining us on Business Talk.
Thank you very much for the nice conversation.